Hola chicos y chicas. In this video we're going to talk about the preterite, which is the past tense, one of the past tenses in Spanish. Let's first, before we get into the Spanish part, just make sure we have a firm understanding of what we are talking about when we say present tense and past tense. When we say present tense, we're talking specifically about something that we either are doing currently right now or something that's a habit. For example, I finish my homework at night. That's a habit, something you do most days. You finish your homework at night. I eat dinner at 6 p.m. Again, another habit. I wash my hands before dinner. Those things would all be considered the present tense. Now let's take a look at the past tense. I finished my homework last night. This is referring to one thing that was done in the past and completed in the past. Last night you did your homework. I ate dinner at 6 p.m. Again, this was something that was clearly done in the past at one time. And then finally, I washed my hands before dinner. It shows that this is something that you did, again, at one single time, and it was completed. So there are just some few examples of what we're talking about when we say the present tense and the past tense. Today, this video is going to focus on the past tense, things that were done and completed in the past. So let's take a look at the two different past tenses in Spanish. And this is a very basic, brief understanding of what the two are. The first one is called the preterite. And the preterite is the one that we're studying in this video. And this refers to actions done in the past that are seen as completed. And that's the most important part of the preterite. And then there's the other past tense in Spanish called the imperfect. And these refer to actions done in the past that are not seen as completed and that don't have a clear beginning or end. We're going to look at those in another video, but you'll understand the difference between the two when we compare them. But for today's sake, we're just going to look at the preterite, and those are actions that are seen as completed. So let's look at how to conjugate verbs in the preterito, which is the preterite, where actions are completed. Now, as you probably guessed, we are going to have charts with these, and this is because the endings on our verbs are going to change to reflect that we are speaking in the past tense. So let's look at AR verbs first, just at AR verbs. For the endings in AR verbs, we have in the yo form, e, the to form, aste, the he, she, usted form, o, nosotros, amos, ustedes, ellos, ellas, aron. Now you'll notice that the nosotros is exactly the same as it is in the present tense. And that's the only one that happens to be that way. We'll look at a few examples with these endings here in just a moment. Now let's take a look at ER and IR verb endings in the preterite tense. So for ER and IR verbs, in the yo form, we have I. In the to form, iste. The he, she, usted form, yo. Nosotros, imos. Ellos, ellas, ustedes, yeron. Again, the ER and IR ones are the same endings, and they're different from the AR verb endings. A couple of rules here. Let's take a look at a couple of very important rules for the past tense. The first rule is that accents are required. Very, very important. Without the accent, it changes the meaning of the word. And that's something you'll learn in the future. But they are absolutely required. And not only are they required, but you should be giving emphasis when speaking these words on those accented syllables. Notice they sound different than they do in present tense endings, so we have to make sure we give it that emphasis. Second rule is that some verbs are irregular and they don't follow the standard pattern. You'll be learning those at a separate time, but keep in mind not every single verb in the preterite tense will follow all of these endings that you see above. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples of verbs in the preterite tense. When conjugating verbs in the preterite tense, we have two different sets of endings for AR verbs and ER verbs. Let's first look at the AR verbs. When conjugating verbs in the preterite, and specifically AR verbs, it follows the standard process of conjugating any verb. You've already learned this before. Let's look at the verb hablar, to talk. To conjugate hablar in the preterite tense, to say I talked, with the ed at the end, I talked in the past tense, all we do is we remove the ar, so we're left with our stem habl, and we replace it with the ending e. Yo hablé, I talked. And the same works for all other regular AR verbs in all forms of the verb. Estudiar, to study. If we want to say you studied in the past tense, tú estudiaste. We remove the AR and we add the aste to the end of our stem. Comprar, él compró. Tomar, nosotros tomamos. Cerrar, ellas cerraron. Very standard process. And the same works for ER and IR verbs. Let's look at those really quick. So if we look at a couple of examples of ER and IR verbs mixed together, since they have the same endings, follow the same process. Let's take the verb escribir, to write. If I wanted to say I wrote in the past tense, in the preterite tense specifically, take off the IR and replace it with the E ending. Yo escribí. Vivir, to live. I wanted to say you lived in the preterite tense. Take off the IR and add our ending. Tú viviste. Correr, él corrió. He ran. Beber, nosotros bebimos. Notice, even though this is an ER verb, we still have the IMOS ending, imos, since these are for both ER and IR verbs. And finally, asistir, to attend. Ellas asistieron, they attended. And so you can see that the process is exactly the same. We take off the AR, the ER, or the IR, and we replace it with the appropriate ending depending on who is doing the action or who did the action in the past tense. Now, as I already mentioned, there are two different past tenses in Spanish. We have the preterito and the imperfecto. We're learning specifically about the preterito, so right now we are going to learn when to use the preterito as opposed to the imperfecto, the imperfect. We talked about our overall general rule of actions being completed. So keep that in mind as we look through our 5 rules when to use the preterito, and we'll look at some examples with each rule. Número uno, actions in the past that are viewed as single events will be considered preterito. I walked through the park. One time I did that, it was one event, it was done in the past, so I would use my verb in the preterito. Yo caminé por el parque. I wrote a letter to my grandma yesterday. Le escribí una carta a mi abuela ayer. Did it one time, it was a single event, and it was done in the past, and I used my preterite conjugation. Also notice the indirect object pronoun. Can use those in the past tense as well. Notice we have an AR verb here and an IR verb here. Again, single events. That's our first rule. Let's look at another rule. Our second rule for using the preterito is when an action is in the past and it's been repeated a specific number of times. Let's look at an example to help make some sense of this. Last week, my wife bought pizza for dinner 4 times. It was the same event repeated a specific number of times. La semana pasada, mi esposa compró, she bought, la pizza para la cena 4 veces, 4 times. This tells us that it was repeated, and therefore we use the preterito. Last year, my mom attended 4 concerts. El año pasado, mi madre asistió 4 conciertos. She attended, asistió, because it was a specific number of times, a specific event, we use the preterito. That's rule number 2. Let's move on to rule number 3. For our third rule, we are talking about actions in the past that occurred during a specific period of time. For example, in a number of years or a number of hours. And then we would clarify this as being in the preterite. So let's look at an example. My brother and I worked at the store for 4 years. That is our period of time. It was in the past, so we use the preterito. Mi hermano y yo trabajamos en la tienda por 4 años. We worked. My friends and I lived in Florida for 2 years. There's our period of time. Mis amigos y yo vivimos en Florida por 2 años. We lived. Using the preterito because it was a specific period of time. Okay, we have 2 more rules to cover in our 5 rules. Let's keep moving forward. Our fourth rule for when to use the preterito deals with a chain of events. So a series of things that were done in the past that were a chain of events. Yesterday my parents got up, made breakfast, and cleaned the house. That was a series of events all done in the past, so we used the preterito. Mis padres se levantaron, prepararon el desayuno y limpiaron la casa. Notice we can make reflexive verbs in the past tense as well, in the preterite specifically, and that works just fine. We keep the se, and we conjugate our verb in the preterite for they, my parents. Last Christmas, my brothers received lots of gifts, opened them, and then broke them. Again, a chain of events. La Navidad pasada, mis hermanos recibieron muchos regalos, los abrieron y después los rompieron. They received, they opened, and they broke. That is our chain of events. Okay, so that's rule number 4, and let's move on to our last rule here for when to use el preterito. Our fifth and final rule for when to use the preterito deals with actions that have a specific end or beginning. So when we're stating the beginning or end of an event in the past, we use the preterito. Let's look at a couple of simple examples here. Last night it started to snow. We are marking the beginning of the snow. Anoche empezó a nevar. It started, that's our past tense there, our preterite, and there's our preterite ending, empezó. She finished the test early. We're marking the end of the event here. She finished, so it would be ella terminó con el examen temprano. So there's our 5 rules for when to use the preterito. Feel free to briefly review those 5 rules so you are able to recognize when to use the preterito as opposed to the imperfecto, and keep those things in mind when thinking about the past tense. Okay, let's look at some examples and some practice now to see how we do with our preterite verb conjugations. What I would like you to do is to pause the video here in just a moment and see if you can put these sentences into Spanish, keeping in mind that you need to use the preterite because each of these situations fits at least one of our rules for using the preterito. One thing I would like to point out before you get working here on your practice sentences is that when we ask questions in the preterito, you'll see the word did often. Did you study last night? Did you talk to him last night? You'll be tempted to translate that word did to use the verb hacer in the past tense. However, that is not the case. We simply ignore the did and we use the verb and conjugate that in the preterite tense. So ignore the did. It's included in the question mark, really, and simply conjugate the verb in the preterite tense that is being referred to in the sentence. Okay, go ahead and give this a shot. See if you can translate these sentences. Let's pause the video right now, and when you're ready to check your progress, go ahead and advance the video and see how you did. So if we look at the answers for each of our sentences here, número 1, ¿estudiaste anoche? Did you study last night? There is our ending aste because we are in the to form. Número 2, ¿le hablaste a él anoche? Did you speak to him last night? There is our past tense. You can see the ending there. Número 3, nosotros pescamos por 8 horas ayer. Some of you might be thinking, okay, pescamos could mean we fish or we fished in the past tense. That's true, it could. So how do we tell the difference? You can tell by the context of the sentence. This word ayer, yesterday, tips us off that we are supposed to use el preterito and not the present tense. Número 4. ¿Qué llevó tu amiga a la fiesta anoche? What did your friend wear to the party last night? What did she wear? So we are in the ella form and we use the o with an accent to describe that specific verb. Y número 5. Mis padres no mandaron las invitaciones ayer. My parents didn't send the invitations yesterday. We're in the they form and el preterito, and it's that simple. Okay, let's take a look at some ER-IR practice now to get some extra work with those endings. Again, just like before, take some time, pause the video here, see if you can try these sentences before advancing the video, and then check out your progress to see how you did. Let's take a quick look at our answers here for our sentences using ER, IR verbs in the preterite tense. Yo leí ese libro 3 veces el año pasado. I read that book 3 times last year. Notice we drop off the ER in leer and we replace it with the yo form in el pretérito. Yo leí. Número 2. ¿Comiste la pizza anoche? Did you eat the pizza last night? And again, notice the word did is not translated here. We simply stick with our verb and we conjugate it in el pretérito. Número 3. ¿Abriste tus regalos? Did you open your gifts? Mis hermanos y yo bebimos 5 vasos de leche. Nosotros bebimos. Y número 5. Mis abuelos vivieron en Arizona en el año 1998. Vivieron, they lived. So hopefully you did well on these. If you need to go back through and review, please feel free to do so. Start studying your conjugation charts. And at this point, you're going to want to take a look at your 5 rules again, and look at them often to remind yourself when we use el pretérito. Mucha suerte y adiós. Hasta la próxima vez.